And just to catch the audience up here, this week the Prime Minister signed on to his biggest spending commitment yet. Canada is now on the hook to spend 5% of its GDP on defence by 2035, which is the new agreed-upon NATO spending target. The Prime Minister says it will cost Canada about $150 billion a year, and most of that will go directly to military spending on things such as equipment and personnel, but more than a fifth of that money can go to infrastructure, things such as airports or roads to mineral projects and ports and other telecommunications and other expenditures like that. So, Minister, a big commitment this week with Europe, in addition to trying to expand the partnership and the trading relationships you outlined. But defence is now going to become the biggest line item, spending item in the Canadian budget. And the Prime Minister suggested it may force a conversation about some things the federal government can no longer do, at least towards the end of the decade. Do you think Canadians will sign on to that if it means losing out in other areas?
Well, David, let's take a step back and talk about the important moment in Canada's committing to the 2% of GDP target that Canadians have repeatedly asked us to do. And our government under Prime Minister Mark Carney is going to be doing it this year. And so we are standing up as a founding member of NATO and a multilateral partner with all other countries to ensure that we're at 2%. And we are also committing to 5% in the long term. That's by 2035 with a review period in 2029. So let's make sure we have all those facts on the table.
Sure.
Now let's down that 5%. The 5% is, after we get to 2% this year, leaves 3%, obviously. 1.5% is going to be on investments in critical defense and security related expenditures, airports and ports, emergency preparedness systems. Those are infrastructure projects that will benefit the Canadian economy overall, David. So there is a dual purpose, dual use out of that expenditure. And then 1.5 additional percentage points are going to be spent, first and foremost, I will add, on core military expenditures, supports for the Canadian Armed Forces, and ensuring that they have the military equipment that they need. We know that the Canadian Armed Forces is an institution that does need further supports, whether we're talking about salaries and other supports like housing, or whether we're talking about key pieces of infrastructure and equipment. And the good news is that our government is taking those requirements on board immediately.
No, and Minister, I get the breakdown and I understand the value of that money in those specific sectors, but I was struck by what the Prime Minister said, that towards the later part of this decade and into the early part of the next decade, if the spending does keep growing like this, like $150 billion, because we're using current dollars, not 2035 dollars, that's a third of all government spending right now. And the Prime Minister made the point that it will likely force a conversation about some things like the federal government can no longer do if you have to keep meeting these spending levels based on the threat environment of the day. And I just wonder what it is you think at this point might be squeezed out by the need to meet these NATO commitments.
So let's be clear. When you're dealing with federal money, which is taxpayer dollars, there is always that calibration of how we prioritize domestic economic and personal needs, if you will, whether we're talking about families or seniors or students or children. Those are all groups that our government has committed to, whether it's the Canada Child Benefit or the $10 a day childcare or increases in OAS and GIS that our government has committed to. But in the long term, of course, we're going to have to calibrate the needs of Canadians and weigh those needs against expenditures generally, whether it is on defense expenditures or other, expenditures overall. And that's a matter of dealing with scarce resources. Governments must do that responsibly. And so, what the Prime Minister is saying in the first instance, reaching 2% is a responsible decision. Making sure that we are collectively acting with our allies as we move towards 5% is also responsible. And finally, making sure that we do that reevaluation in 2029 and recalibrate where the priorities must lie for Canadians in terms of where they are at right now. What are the needs of Canadians? That's a conversation, of course, that will be had, and we will make sure it is done responsibly.
Well, Minister, as you well know, committing to a spending target, planning for a spending target, are not executing a spending target. And you've been Minister of Defence, you've done procurement and Treasury Board, so you're well aware of the challenges that have existed, right, in terms of getting procurement money out the door in particular. So how realistic is it that you can get this done in the time frame that's available? Like, let's look at the 2029 horizon, for example, of being reasonably on the way there. And I mean, what tripwires have to be overcome inside the system as it exists right now? Because I know you want to build a domestic industrial capacity for this, but that's likely going to take a bit of time before it's ready to work. So how quickly can you move on this?
Well, David, these are my favorite questions, so thanks for asking them. I will say, first and foremost, we have an agency that we are setting up to ensure that procurements can move faster. Second of all, we need to ensure that our domestic industrial base is activated, and that will be the case, for example, with the EU Strategic Partnership Agreement that we just signed last Monday, so that domestic companies are going to be able to compete on par with European companies in terms of procurements overseas. And then thirdly, I will say that there are procurements in line to be executed as we speak, whether we're talking about the River class destroyers, whether we're talking about the F-35s, whether we're talking about ensuring that those polar icebreakers are built and functional. These are all fundamental procurements that are underway, and we will make sure that the Canadian Armed Forces are well supported in terms of their salaries and wages, but also in terms of the equipment that they are utilizing to defend and protect our country.
Okay, Minister, I've gone over time.